Support the Bartholomewtown Podcast by subscribing, rating, and reviewing on Apple Podcasts.
This is the Bartholomewtown Podcast.
Welcome in to another edition of the Bartholomewtown Podcast. I'm your host, Bill Bartholomew. On today's episode, I sit down with Scott MacKay. Scott MacKay is a political analyst for the Publix Radio, the NPR affiliate that covers Rhode Island and southeastern Massachusetts through a variety of terrestrial and digital platforms. Our conversation touched on Scott's storied, multi-decade career in journalism, including covering then Burlington, Vermont Mayor Bernie Sanders, time spent at the Providence Journal, and his transition to radio. We touched on all sorts of elements of Rhode Island history, politics, media, and art, and Scott had no problem offering his signature commentary style throughout our conversation. Enjoy new episodes of the Bartholomewtown Podcast every Tuesday and Friday. Listen on your favorite app. Visit bartholomewtown.com or ripodcast.com. It's where you'll find the dozens of conversations I've had with Rhode Island influencers like Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, Congressman David Cicilline, newswoman Kim Kalunian, communications strategist Mike Rea, Attorney General Peter Nerona, policy strategist Rebecca Weber, the Z-Boys. It's all right there for you at bartholomewtown.com. Hey, if you're in southern New England, you may also catch Bartholomewtown content on Thursdays. Tune in at 3 p.m. to 101.1 FM, WVVX Providence Community Radio, and read Bartholomewtown print pieces and the new issues of Motif Magazine. I usually provide a little analysis and insight in addition to extrapolating from these very podcast episodes. And by the way, I had a great time as a panelist on a lively experiment on Rhode Island PBS this past week. You can find the link on my Twitter handle at Bill Bartholomew or on Instagram at Bartholomewtown Podcast. All right, a mighty familiar voice to Rhode Islanders. Let's get right to it. My conversation with the one and only Scott MacKay.
Well, you know, I was in college when I kind of got bitten with a journalism bug, and I worked for the student newspaper like a lot of people do. And then I was kind of lucky enough, the local daily, the Burlington Free Press, which Gannett had just purchased it a while back, but it was still a pretty good little paper. I mean, it was the biggest paper in Vermont, circulation about 50,000. This is before the internet. We're talking the mid-1970s now.
Gotcha.
So we're going way, way back. But so I started covering, I got paid the princely sum of $15 a game. I started covering high school sports.
Yep.
I'd cover basketball, the Burlington against Rice High School, South Burlington against Burlington. And I could get paid $25 if I actually traveled all the way to like St. Albans for a hockey game. The coldest place in the world would be this Quonset Hut rink right on Lake Champlain in St. Albans when it's 10 below zero. It's just like crazy, but that's how I started. And then after I got out of school, I started stringing for them and moved away just from sports and started doing some news. And I got to know city government pretty well. I'd been a history and political science major, and I got to know the community. I wasn't one of these college kids who spent all his time hanging out just on campus. Mm-hmm. I kind of think when you get like to be a junior or a senior, you get kind of bored with the same, you know, you've been to all those fraternity parties. You've seen
enough calzones.
Yeah, you've seen the campus movies and done all that nonsense. So I was able to catch on after being a stringer for a while, which probably the equivalent of being an intern nowadays. And so they hired me, and I started covering local government. And then I had some kind of luck. I went off after just a brief time doing that in Burlington. I was very young, but I ended up covering the State House in Montpelier, which we call Montpelier. It's a fun little town. And so I got to know Vermont politics very well. And then Bernie Sanders got elected mayor of Burlington, Vermont, which was a huge upset. He had won by 10 votes, basically, in an election where the old Democratic machine in town had become so rusty they couldn't even steal a 10-vote election. So it was kind of fun to cover City Hall when Sanders was there because when he first came in, there were all kinds of battles with the old guard in the city and kind of the new folks, the new demographic of Burlington, which had been a lot of people who'd gone to college there, UVM or St. Michael's, and they decided to stay. And what would happen is that this young demographic kind of made Burlington a music and arts center, and restaurants and all that started to change. And Sanders kind of caught that wind, and then he won a couple terms. And then I realized that although I loved Vermont, you get to a certain age and you either have to choose Vermont or choose journalism. And at that point, I was able to get a job at the Providence Journal. And I came down here and I worked in the bureau, what we call the state staff, which they used to have. The Journal used to have bureaus all over.
Oh, yeah. South County, West Bay, East Bay, whatever it was, right?
East Bay. I had the privilege of being the exalted title of the East Bay Bureau Manager. Wow, that was a big thing. I had to make sure that all of the school committee and town council meetings in Barrington, Bristol, Warren, and East Providence got covered. That was basically the big thing to cover. Before that, I'd been in West Warwick, which was quite a cultural shock after Burlington, Vermont.
Yeah.
You know, the hip Wazee town, to go to this blue-collar town that I thought was kind of mired in the 1950s. But it was interesting. And I was born in Providence, so I knew what I was getting into kind of. With these old textile communities. And I lived around here in Connecticut. I grew up in Thompson, Connecticut, right across the line from Burrillville. So, you know, like you, I knew what Rhode Island was all about. And so I worked for the Journal, and then I got a job covering Providence City Hall. And it was right after Buddy had crashed and burned. So it was like the Joe Paolino administration back in 1986, 87, 88. And then he went out and ran for governor in 1990. So the logical progression was I ended up back at the State House in Providence.
Right.
So from one state house to another.
It's interesting you started in Vermont. Montpelier is, you know, there's no fast food. There's none of that, right? That's kind of part of the town. It's just an off-the-grid town, essentially, when it comes to corporations.
It's about the smallest, I believe still is, the smallest state capital in the country. It's a town of only 7,000 or 8,000 people. It's a very white-collar town. They have a couple of big insurance companies there.
Yeah.
And they have the economy, also a lot of state employees, obviously, mostly the white-collar folks. And the town next to Barry, Vermont, was always the blue-collar town. It was an old granite center. They had extractive industries, and the people worked, they called down the rock. They were actually, you know, real blue-collar jobs with people with calluses on their hand who were busting rock, granite. Their industry was basically making gravestones is what they did. So it was kind of an interesting contrast there in central Vermont. And a lot different from Burlington. One of the problems Vermont's had is kind of like the textile industries, manufacturing here. They're extractive industries like marble outside of Rutland and granite in Barry have really imploded. So those towns, you drive through what used to be kind of thriving main streets and you see all these empty storefronts. And they have some real serious problems with opiates, as a lot of former manufacturing towns in New England have, particularly in some of the rural areas. So you see that nowadays. I still go back to Vermont, though. I still love it. I have friends up there. It's a fun place to go, especially in the summer. If you're a skier, people like to go in the winter. But my ankles, I'm 100 years old, and my ankles aren't really up to that anymore.
Gotcha. Well, it's interesting to think about Rhode Island as a large population center and a place that, even though, of course, it's a small state, the smallest state geographically, obviously, you know, to go from a Vermont, I suppose if you came from a New Hampshire town or certain aspects of even Portland, you know, Portland, Maine, entering Providence is entering a much larger market than an area like that. So the progression for you, it's an interesting look at Providence.
It is. It's very densely populated. One of the things that you learn if you worked around New England, and I have a lot, is that you could almost draw a line in the old days from Bennington over to Kittery. And the three northern states were very rural, Yankee, agricultural, or in case of Maine, timber interests, New Hampshire, and Vermont, very much dairy farms, that kind of economic base. And the three southern states were, you know, urban, Catholic, ethnic, much different and much into manufacturing, much more densely populated than northern Vermont. And it's interesting to see the changes that have come, because I can make an argument, and it's not a bad argument, that New Englanders nowadays, You run the thing back to 1960. The three northern New England states all voted for Nixon, whereas Kennedy that year won Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island was his highest percentage state. Again, a majority Roman Catholic states. But nowadays, I can make an argument that New Englanders are more like each other than we are like the rest of the country, particularly a country that's polarized itself, is very polarized, divided between the red corner and the blue corner.
Absolutely. I think that there's also a movement, a lot of people that I know, just anecdotally, that have left Rhode Island. They've gone to New Hampshire. They've gone to, in some cases, Burlington. But the seacoast, New Hampshire, that's where my sister and many of her friends from southern Rhode Island moved. My mom left. My parents sold their place in Rhode Island. They're up there now. And it seems like New England as a whole is becoming more regionalized,
it's more
sort
fluid.
of a megapolis.
There's a lot of reasons for that. I think the first wave of people moving to New Hampshire from Massachusetts especially goes back to the 60s and 70s. And what happened there is a lot of these people were tax refugees, frankly, and they'll live free or die more libertarian. But in the last 20 to 30 years, and if you talk to people at like the UNH Survey Center, University of New Hampshire, and the people who really follow politics up there, you'll find that a lot of the new people from Massachusetts, that southern New Hampshire just really became a big bedroom community, that people wanted more land, for instance. They wanted closer to ski areas, closer to the lakes and things, but they kept their political views. New Hampshire has become much more democratic and liberal than it used to be, and Vermont, I can argue, is probably the bluest state in the country.
Fascinating. Right, because I can even recall, there's still an element of it, of course, but where New Hampshire was kind of the conservative state in New England, you'd always be seeing the Republican candidates, obviously within the context of the primary, but also broadly, campaigning hard up there.
Yeah, we used to call it kind of the Sun Belt of New England when it came to politics, not obviously the weather. But I think that if you look at New Hampshire, one of the reasons it's still a good predictor of Democratic candidates. It's a much better predictor of Democratic candidates now than it is Republican candidates. If you look at the presidential primaries in the last few runs, Republicans, people like MacKay, for instance, or can win a New Hampshire, but then they go down to South Carolina, and the southern states are now really kind of the bellwether for a Republican nominee. One thing about New Hampshire is, even though you have a lot of Republicans, they don't tend to be as far right on social issues as, say, the Southerners who are really into evangelical Christianity. There's not a lot of evangelicals in any New England state. There's a few, but we don't kind of have that red state, the anti-abortion, the real tough anti-gay marriage, all of those social issues. I think in New Hampshire, they're more libertarian, kind of the live free or die thing you see on the license plate. And I don't think they really want the government poking into a lot of people's business. And you'd be surprised. I mean, for a long time there, it was very rare for New Hampshire to have, Republican, excuse me, very rare for New Hampshire to have a lot of Democratic statewide politicians. But now it's become almost de rigueur. The Jeannie Shaheens, the Hassans, both U.S. senators are Democratic women. Nobody could predict that in 1974, that's for sure.
Right.
And I think you've seen other folks, the legislature has shifted back now, many more Democrats than Republicans. However, I would argue it's still the state in New England with the best Republican infrastructure on the ground, something that you don't see in Massachusetts or Rhode Island, even Connecticut to a certain degree, but Republicans can win statewide in Massachusetts. They can win statewide in Rhode Island. But it's very rare that Republicans have the infrastructure to, for instance, be able to put together a statewide themed race to take over one or two houses of the state legislature. You look at Massachusetts, Rhode Island, very lopsided Democratic state legislatures in both states.
Yeah, big time. I mean, it's essentially a monolithic operation here in Rhode Island. Now that there's very recent developments in the Republican Party that there's additional fracturing there, but certainly the Democratic Party in Rhode Island is heading to a crossroads in the next 5 years or so.
Well, we're seeing factions in both parties. I think what you see in the Democratic Party is an upswing in women. Finally, what Rhode Island has always been full of, if you look and see how this has flipped over the last 20, 25 years, you're seeing many more liberals. They call themselves progressives nowadays, which is fine. And you're seeing many more suburban parts of the party. Rhode Island has always been run for years. The State House leadership was usually urban, ethnic, Roman Catholic males. And there still is a lot of that left. However, you're seeing more and more and more the influence of women. We just saw this reproductive rights, the codifying Roe v. Wade into state law. Frankly, that would not have happened 25 or 30 years ago. You're seeing a bunch of confluence among trends like more women in politics, the declining influence of the Roman Catholic Church in the state, and an increase in more suburban folks moving up in the legislature. On the Republican side, it's kind of flipped. If I can take you back to the 1980s and 90s, the Republicans were the pro-choice party in Rhode Island, frankly. You have people like John Chafee, Claudine Schneider, Susan Farmer, Lila Sapensley, who was the minority leader. And they were the party that opened the doors to women, frankly, before the Democrats did. And Susan Farmer was the first woman back in the 1980s to win a statewide office as Secretary of State. They tended to be Protestant with the occasional Jewish person like Lila Sapensley. And they tended to be stronger on women's rights and more towards the live and let live, old-style New England politics. You know, good fences make good neighbors, but I'm not really here to tell you how to live, versus the way that kind of the more traditional machine-style politicians, the old Irish Catholic folks, who, of course, went that way because they had to take over the state from, the Protestant mill owners and the rural. I mean, this state was so malapportioned. Part of the corruption was you go back to an era. Talk about voter suppression. They did it in Rhode Island better than anywhere in the world. Immigrants couldn't vote. Even naturalized citizens couldn't vote. And then when too many Irish came here and started becoming citizens and born here, they instituted this property standard. You had to have $134 in real property, which I don't know what that's like nowadays, but probably like having $50,000 or something in real property. That means you had to have land or cash or something worth that much money in order to vote. And of course, only white males could vote.
Right.
So, it was a long, long time that Rhode Island, I think if you go back to the Depression, John Gunther in his Book of the States said that of all the northern states, Rhode Island was still the most glacially controlled by an old aristocratic elite. And then what happens is in the 1930s with the bloodless revolution, that all changes during the Depression when Theodore Francis Green was the Yankee kind of titular head of it. This happened in all three states. Wilbur Cross was the guy in Connecticut who was the governor who did this. And a guy named Lee in Massachusetts, Governor Lee. Lee didn't last that long because the Irish from Boston took over the party again. He was only one term, I believe. But Wilbur Cross was there for quite a while. And, of course, Theodore Francis Green goes on to become a U.S. Senator. And he was there till he was like, I believe, age 93. And it was pretty interesting because this guy was a fuddy-duddy, old wasp who taught Roman law at Brown University. But what he was able to do was the same thing Roosevelt did nationally. He was able to put all of the urban ethnic groups, and being pro-labor, he was able to bring them all into the Democratic Party and give them each some patronage. Everybody got some jobs, and, he had enough money to run campaigns in those days. And that was a big change in Rhode Island when they did the bloodless revolution the first day, New Year's Day in 1935. And if I've written about it, if you're interested,
I'm super interested.
Good, I will send you some stuff on it.
Absolutely.
It's a fascinating story. It really is, of how the state changed overnight.
Yeah, that's incredibly fascinating. I spent a little bit of time on the Door Rebellion last year, getting deep on that. And so I'm familiar with the blood. Obviously, a totally different layout, but at the same time.
There was the Door Rebellion, again, was kind of a rebellion of those who had been left out. It was, soft money farmers and hard money merchants and kind of the elite in Providence and the people who ran things. And these folks wanted the right to vote, and they didn't want to just be woodcutters out there. They wanted to say and run their government.
Kind of circling back, you were at the Providence Journal. We've obviously seen media changes and shifts over the last decade or so, and it's now at rapid fire every day. It seems like there's some new development in technology, or one person's now suddenly working for a university and not a journalist anymore, whatever it is. But you were, I vaguely remember when I was in New York when you joined then Rhode Island Public Radio. I vaguely remember this happening and being like, wow, that's a somewhat seismic indicator.
Well, I wasn't the only one. I think what's happened is a lot of people, we have a lot of print refugees. This is around the country who've gone to National Public Radio affiliates everywhere, and even some on the national staff. And I think what a lot of us saw with the winnowing down of the traditional news media and the fact that the economic basis no longer worked for monopoly newspapers. You forget, if you're a paper like the Boston Globe or the Providence Journal, if you looked at this as an economist, this is basically what you had. It was like electric utility.
Right.
Protected by the First Amendment from regulation.
Yeah.
And advertising was the main fulcrum for your business model. That's how you got your money. And so what happened was, if you had to sell anything when you were a kid, or I was a kid, if you're going to sell anything in Rhode Island, I don't care if it was a used lawnmower or a new Mercedes, you had to advertise in the Providence Journal. And then that all got broken. The internet crashed that. I would argue that newspapers they had stodgy leadership for years. They made some big mistakes, but you can't just replay that. And I think what the beauty of NPR is that all of our money, 94% of our money, comes from the community. So if people want us on the air, and I know sometimes the pledge drives, people get obnoxious. You don't think we like them any more than you do you? I mean, who wants to spend 2 hours today, on air, basically begging people for money? We try to appeal to your better angels, but still, I'd rather be out, covering a story or on the phone trying to, get something.
Yep.
But it's a model that has worked, and it's nonprofit. And I kind of looked at the Journal when things were crashing and burning there, and I looked around and said, okay, I'm at a certain age. I don't want to start totally over in another market or anything. And I'm married. My wife at that point is a doctor in town working at Rhode Island Hospital. So I was pretty much anchored here. And I love the state, and I love the area. I was born at Lying In. I'm like, been around here. I was hatched in Rhode Island. I was mashed in Rhode Island. And I'll probably be dispatched in Rhode Island. And so I was in my early to mid 50s, and I said, okay, I've got to work for maybe at least 8 or 10 more years, and I need to find some kind of a safe place. And so when the station decided to go in a little heavier on politics, they had a job open, and I applied for it, and so did my friend Ian Donis, who then was the editor of the Providence Phoenix.
Yep.
And so he brought some things that I certainly did not have. He really was one of the people in this market, along with Matt Jersick, who's more of an activist, who started Rhode Island Future. And Ian was somebody who really kind of saw the power of using the internet and the kind of online digital capability that was out there. And he really started doing that at the Phoenix, and it was pretty successful. And he really was able to garner a lot of attention to, this kind of alternative weekly with what he was doing with his own brand on the side. And so he was very attractive, and he's a good writer. He worked for the AP. He's a clean writer. He worked for the Worcester Telegram before that, so he had some newspaper background, and he was a pretty good news guy. And so then I came along, and what I had was knowing the market and the history really well, which I'd been around and covering the State House and regional politics. I know Boston State House. I've covered New Hampshire primaries and been around that much. So basically, the guy couldn't decide. He decided to hire both of us.
Nice.
Which has worked out really well because Ian is really good at staying on top of things at the State House, and he's really got a lot of good sources, and he works hard, and that allows me to be a little more bird's eye view. Be more of a pundit and a commentator, which is good, and have a bird's eye view. Reporters tend to have a worm's eye view. Mm-hmm. And I think you need both. I think you need to be out there, if I have to go to the State House, I'll go to the State House, and, it's not a big deal. And Ian, with his Friday column, is able to actually put some analysis in there, some really astute analysis. So it works out both ways, and we help each other out when we have to. So it's been a really good partnership. The station, I will say, since we have a better signal, 89.3, and we have our partnership with the University of Massachusetts Dartmouth in covering southeastern Massachusetts now, we've been able just to hire a reporter for New Bedford. We have this lovely young person, Nadine Sabai, who is covering the State House in Sacramento. We're lucky to have her. We have a new morning producer who's a recent Brown graduate, Sophia Rudin, who's doing some really nice stuff. So it's nice to see that even though we're a small canoe, we're not I kind of think when you leave a big newspaper, it's kind of like, okay, they're rearranging, the deck chairs on the Titanic, and here I am in this small boat, rowing upstream, but everybody's pulling with the same oar. And that's been a real good feeling, frankly, working for an NPR. I mean, the journalism is really good. It's the journalism of verification. It's old style, what main stream newspapers did for years. You need two sources. You write a correction if you're wrong. Your opinion's your opinion, but facts are facts. And, you label things opinion that are opinion, and you try to do the best you can to reflect the community. And I don't even know how many hits or clicks I get on what I do with our new website, which is, in a way, it's kind of like wandering around in the fog with blinders on. But on the other hand, I kind of like the fact that management isn't on top of our case every single day looking for clickbait, which some of the other online sites, as you know, no names mentioned, do. And so we the pressure for us is more to reflect the community and do an honest job. We don't engage in some of the other broadcast talk radio shows. Yep. If you listen to what Ian and I do on Political Roundtable, you'll find that it's pretty measured. We try to keep it civil. We're not into people shouting at each other and calling each other names. We're trying to hold people accountable in the political sphere, but we're not out there shouting at each other.
Yeah, massive difference from one end of the dial to the other in this town.
Yeah, and cable television. I think cable television really started a paradigm. Of course, that paradigm started, I would argue, with Rush Limbaugh and a lot of the kind of shock jock radio people, Don Imus. And a lot of that's been transferred now to what you see on Fox or MSNBC. And, I think a lot of us had high hopes for the internet and cable when it first came in. We said, this is great, going to bring the world to your living room. And now I look back and I say, geez, all this is doing is bringing you to your living room. Yeah. And we're all in our own corners, and people too often only are accessing news or stories that they think backs up their own views that are really closely held. And it's not like Brandeis and his famous decision about why you had to allow different signs in the park, in a public park, from competing political folks and soapboxes, because it gave everybody a chance to, interact with the other side. I think too often that the new digital world and the online world has just brought people to their own places and just reinforces things that they already think.
Yeah, narrow casting. And we see that here in Rhode Island, too.
We see it everywhere. I don't think Rhode Island's immune from any of these national trends. I mean, the one thing that you have to understand about New England when I go around the country is New England, the Deep South, and parts of the Midwest are really rooted places. They are still places with strong local cultures. It's not like if you're in Florida. I was in Orlando a couple of weeks ago, and I thought I was in Ball Hill Road with palm trees.
Yeah.
And nobody
Exactly.
and nobody is from there. Sometimes you'll talk to people.
Right.
Just my wife had some meetings, and I just tagged along to get some sun, basically, because it was cold here. And you talk to people, and it's like everybody's from somewhere else. And you see this a lot in the southern Sun Belt states, the Arizonas, the Californias. But in New England, we're still, people, it's still pretty much, oh, you mean you don't like the Red Sox? What's wrong with this guy?
Yeah.
Unless you're an Italian guy over age 60, then you all root for the Yankees. We understand that.
Yeah, that's why they still broadcast the Yanks out here, really,
Sure.
for that demo. But, no, I totally agree. I mean, my family, through genealogy work or whatever, found, my cousin discovered we were on the Mayflower 2. Can go all the way back there. So,
I always liked Bill Weld, the former governor of Massachusetts, who used to say, no, we didn't come over on the Mayflower. We sent the servants over. We came on the second boat.
Yeah, that's about right, unfortunately. How do we build digital media outlets that are credible around here when you have, the inundation of branded content all the time?
Here's what I think. I think that the whole news business is in flux. And I don't think Jim Hummel, he does some decent stuff. I'm not out to go after him, frankly. There are others in the market that are much, much worse for a whole lot of reasons. Yeah. Now, we hope that the market will sort this out, that people will be smart enough to go to the brands that they can trust. And I worry about the First Amendment, not because it doesn't protect us and we can't be protected by the law. And obviously I made my living all my life as a First Amendment absolutist. But don't forget, freedom of the press can't solve every problem in the civic culture. One thing I've noticed is an alarming rate of what I would call historical and civic illiteracy. Even among young people, I've talked to professors who teach at Brown who say that they're surprised that even with really, really smart kids coming from great high schools and prep schools, among the smartest, high school seniors in the country, that they don't really know as much about civics as previous generations. The three branches of government, and there's some. Pew did a big survey on this, and you see some numbers in there that like 60% of the folks can't name the three branches of government.
60%?
In the general populace.
Oh my God.
That people don't really understand what the Bill of Rights says, or can't name more than they don't know what the First Amendment is. There's a lot of people who seem to know what their Second Amendment rights are.
Yeah, that's
but I mean, seriously, I just think there's a level of historical illiteracy that I think is kind of alarming, and I think it gets to the real problem with a civic culture when only half your people vote, when a lot of people are somewhat ignorant of what's going on, and on top of all that, now we see the cratering of local journalism. And that's the one really bad thing I think about the decline of newspapers is just that whole idea that somebody there is kind of a watchdog, on your town council, on your school committee, or even that somebody's bringing you news of the local election. I was kind of surprised the night of the special election over in Bristol that I was the only one at the campaign headquarters there. And usually, you'll see some other reporters there, usually a television station, Channel 12 mostly.
This is at June Speakman's
Yes,
campaign headquarters.
I was kind of surprised that, but it's my district, so at least I know where to go. But at any rate, no, I just think that we're not seeing a level of participation in political culture that we should.
Yeah, I totally agree. Last summer, I remember I started asking when people would come up to me and ask me, especially on the left, people in my general demographic would start talking politics or whatever. I'd ask them, do you know who Nick Mattiello is? Almost nobody had a clue who he was or understood the dynamics of power in Rhode Island.
Yeah.
So a lot of the things that they were advocating for passionately, they didn't really have the pathway to execute those ideas or even really know where to begin.
I will say I have seen in the Democratic Party, I've seen, because both parties are being realigned as we speak, I am seeing in certain pockets around the state a lot more energy among young people. Now, some of it's really around issue.
Yep.
But the only way you're going to prevail at the State House is to really get behind those issues and get in and dig on it. And I've seen these grassroots campaigns work. The first time that was really interesting to me was back in 2013 was the Gay Marriage Initiative. Again, a lot of the establishment lined up against it. Catholic Church, the bishop saying that we were going down a moral sewer.
Whoa.
If
Tobin?
Bishop Thomas Tobin.
Yep.
And, I'd worked and been in Vermont and seen in Massachusetts, and for some reason, Vermont had civil unions as long ago as 2000 when Howard Dean was in there the first time. And for some reason, the Green Mountains didn't all of a sudden fold into Lake Champlain.
Yeah.
And Massachusetts was the first state in the country where the legislature enacted gay marriage, and Cape Cod somehow hasn't split off and floated off into the Atlantic Ocean.
Right.
And, I always thought that issue was really kind of overblown by some of the anti-folks. I remember I believe it was 1995 or 6 when Governor Link Almond was in that. He was a Republican, moderate Republican. And the legislature passed a law banning gay discrimination against gay people in housing, employment, public accommodations, and the granting of credit, which nowadays seems like that's a no-brainer. But back then, it was a very, very controversial. It really took a lot of arm twisting by people to get it through the House and the Senate. And I remember going to see the governor one day. He didn't tip his hand what he was going to do. And he went over and talked to me, and I said, hello, Gov, what are you going to, and he was a very approachable guy. And what are you going to do with it? He said, well, I'm going to sign it. I said, oh, really? Why? Well, because everybody deserves their rights. But you know what? I'm not going to have a parade, and in 4 months, nobody's going to be talking about this. And that's exactly what happened, because the people who were against it predicted there was going to be a run to the courts with gay people saying they were discriminated against. They were going to go to the Human Rights Commission, all this stuff. Whereas any of us who knew the truth and knew how people reacted every day knew in those days especially that not everybody even wanted to be out. And it was hurt you in certain employment places if you were.
Yeah.
And I took a look a year later just to figure out, just for fun, as a follow-up story, something journalists don't do enough with, I'll tell you. As a follow-up story, I found out that there were almost no cases of gay discrimination, that basically most of the stuff was the Americans for Disabilities Act, where people in wheelchairs who didn't have access to, things they should have access to, maybe City Hall, Town Hall, the hospital, whatever it was. So there were many more folks who were upset about being discriminated against because they had a disability than there were folks because of their sexual orientation.
Not surprising at all. Not surprising at all. I mean, when you look at Governor Kucheri, I'll always tip my hat to him for his handling of the station fire, particularly the day after. He was in Florida, and he turned up the next day, and I appreciate his leadership.
He and his wife were very compassionate people.
Yep.
During that whole time. He was kind of like the state's priest.
Yeah.
He went to every funeral. He went to wakes, and he and his wife, Sue, the late Sue Kucheri, just passed away. They really, really, I think, showed a good face of Rhode Island, too, to national people, and they were compassionate and very decent to everyone. I think the problem with him is he just didn't know how to handle the recession.
Right.
And after the recession, he did something. If you compare Massachusetts with Rhode Island, Deval Patrick saw the recession, saw the decline in state revenues, and said, okay, we're not going to be able to support our schools and our cities and towns given this problem when Wall Street crashed. So he increased the sales tax by 1%.
Yep.
Kucheri was no tax, no tax, no tax. What he did instead was he chopped. And he cut education. He cut higher education, especially, which, as we all know, that's the fulcrum of trying to get people jobs in this new knowledge economy in the 21st century. And he really squeezed the cities and towns to the point where, Central Falls ended up in bankruptcy, and a lot of cities were teetering on the brink. And then he kind of freaks out towards the end of his administration and says, well, I met this retired baseball pitcher, and he's going to bring jobs to Rhode Island. So one of the problems for Don Carcieri is that forever, and there's nothing he can ever do about it, his legacy will be entwined with the infamous and notorious and horrible 38 Studios fiasco that luckily Link Chafee, his successor, did a pretty decent job in cleaning up as far as hiring the right law firms and getting the state some money back through the legal avenue.
And he'll also be dogged, though, by some of his positions. Don Carcieri sat on an anti-gay board at one for many years. I remember that.
He was very strange. He actually even vetoed legislation. I didn't get why he did this. Vetoed legislation that actually to overturn the right of someone who's gay to go see their partner while that person was
hospitalized or whatnot.
Yes, and of course this came about because of the suicide of someone's partner, and the family wouldn't let the partner in, and it just was really and it just seemed kind of mean-spirited from a guy who called himself a Christian and was a practicing Christian, as we all know. I just thought that was a little over the line. And indeed, the legislature did overturn that. They overturned his veto and it became law. But it just struck me as almost mean-spirited. I understand he had a philosophical belief against abortion rights and he was against gay marriage. But something like that, what he did on that one, I just thought I just didn't get it.
Yeah, you would put on as the current governor says, put on the governor's hat, take off the Catholic hat in that moment. But where are we today? We're heading towards this crazy. We're gonna lose a congressman. There's gonna be six people running for governor in the Democratic primary.
The Democratic primary could be. You're right, a 5 or 6 car pileup in that one. We really just don't know. Obviously, there are people who are in office. The Democrats have what the Republicans don't have in this state, which is a pretty good bench. You've got people who've been proven statewide winners, particularly, I would say, Nellie Gorbea. You have Treasurer Seth Magaziner. You have a new Attorney General, Peter Nerona, who is already showing that he's quite a bit different than Peter Kilmartin, the previous Democratic Attorney General. Then you always have some people around the penumbra, and Jim Langevin even saying that, he might come home and run for governor. I don't know if he really wants to do that or not. But again, we are going to lose in 2022 a congressional seat in Rhode Island, and this is merely because the rest of the country's growing faster than we are. People complain about immigration, but boy, we're lucky we've had some Latino immigration, or this would even be worse.
Yeah, we'd be Vermont in whatever it was, Montpelier, come full circle.
Well,
not that bad.
I think one of the things that you have to understand is that Rhode Island is a small place, and, we haven't really grown that much since the end of World War II. We've been 1 million people, a little more, some census, but there's been no big economic reason, like there haven't been big factories moving here. We don't have extractive industries. We don't have oil platforms out in the Atlantic like some of the southern Texas does, or Louisiana, those places. We have a summer tourism industry. We have a lot of old folks who, again, want to get out of the winter and they leave. We also have people who are prone to undercounts, and I think some of these are immigrants, college students. Boston has this problem too, has one of the highest undercounts in census as far as forms that don't get returned, because Boston has over 100,000 college kids.
Yeah.
And they're not all going to stay there when they graduate. So I think it really behooves the politicians to make sure that they get the word out. Now, the governor says she's going to do this, that they get the word out about people standing up and being counted in the census, because it's not only for the congressional seat. That's the big headline. But many, many federal programs and how much money we get are based on population. And so you really want to make sure you have an accurate count so that the state does get its fair share of federal programs, be it flood control, food stamps, education money. There's a whole array of things that come into play here. So you really want to get counted.
John Marion put that number at $3 billion yesterday.
Yeah, John's he's one of the very smart fellows. I don't agree with him on everything. Nobody does, and you're not supposed to. But he really does pay attention. And if he gets into an issue like voting rights or this census issue, he really is very comprehensive about it. He and his people at Common Cause. And before him, Phil West was like that too. They really were people who worked very hard on this. And I think that what you have to do is, and this is why people worry about citizenship questions. I mean, you've already got this this kind of new-blown edict from Washington under the Trump administration. Not that it was totally benign under Obama either, but it's this whole crackdown on immigration has a whole new force now since you have a new administration coming in. And I think the idea is that some people are scared to have any interaction at all with the government. And that's why people worry about things like citizenship questions. Because, you know, if they're going to pick you up going to court, then what's to stop them, the government, you know, this big bad government that people think of, from using census documentation, even though you're not supposed to do that. People are going to fear that for going into some of these neighborhoods where we know there's a plethora of undocumented folks.
Totally legitimate question, and something that's got to get. We got about a year, like 363 days until.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this stuff, because the Congress can't make this decision because it's so divided, that the courts are going to have to sort a lot of this stuff out, as is happening in every other realm, just about, in American jurisprudence these days, whether states can pass these fetal viability things, all kinds of ICE stuff is just out there. The travel ban, everything nowadays seems to get litigated. And the reason for that is it's sad because it's not supposed to, the courts are not supposed to be political players the way they are now. But when the Congress can't act, somebody has to make that decision, and it's going to get bounced to the courts. And the problem is there's this no compromise zone that's in Congress right now. So the left and the right don't talk to each other. The Democrats and Republicans just are, you know, basically we're in the permanent campaign cycle where all they do is looks to us like they fight for the next election. And it used to be people would fight and really campaign hard against each other during election season. And then after that, they'd govern for a couple years. And then they'd start all over again and have the campaign. But nowadays, it's just a permanent campaign. It started in the 90s with Gingrich versus Clinton, and it's only accelerated since then, I would argue.
It's like almost impossible sometimes to tell if an activity is campaign or if a policy position is campaign-oriented or is it actually for improving the state or whatever it may be in that given point in time, or is this just a...
You know, it's getting easier to tell it's all campaign stuff. I mean, maybe I'm getting... Yep. I want to be skeptical. I don't want to be cynical. But, boy, I'll tell you, nowadays, when you see that everything seems to be about fundraising and bulking up for the next election, you know, we're 11 months away from the first primary on the Democratic side, and already everybody's going at it and who's raised the most money. And it seems that we're all now getting back into the horse race of a presidential election. And the people in Congress don't seem to be looking. I mean, there's some things you would think would be nonpartisan. You know, again, another study comes out today. Rhode Island has the worst bridges in the country. Well, you know what? If you look at all the states, we're pretty much all tied for really bad infrastructure, whether it's bridges, roads. You know, I drive through Massachusetts every day on my commute, and I will tell you, Massachusetts may have a better economy in Rhode Island, but their roads have just as many or more potholes. And I think that you'd think something like that would be nonpartisan, that we could figure out a way to get the resources together, to find a way to raise the money to do it, to put the people to work who would actually rebuild our infrastructure. You think we could do that? I mean, that seems to me, it's not about abortion or religion or culture. I mean, the Republicans have people who, you know, can fix roads, and the Democrats have people who fix roads. And you know what? There's really no ideological way to pave a road.
Right, unless you're Joe Trillo using the inferior mix, whatever it is.
Yeah, he actually, there's something to what he said. He just didn't develop it right. But, you got to figure out, I mean, this is something that should be nonpartisan. Okay, we've fallen behind in this measure. How do we find the resources to do this? Put the contracts out there. Let's make sure they're honestly let these contracts, and let's have both sides come together and really try to do this for the whole country and for people's children and grandchildren. What I worry about is too much policy, and the baby boomers, my generation's actually doing this, and not me personally, I hope. But I think we're making life really hard for young people in a very unfair way, particularly the cuts over the years to public higher education, so that people now come out of college with this mountain of student loan debt, and then we wonder why they aren't out buying houses and getting married and starting families. Well, if you got $100,000 that you got to pay off, you're not going to be able to buy that first house for a while. You're not going to be able to take a big vacation. You're not going to be able to do as much in the community. You might be working 2 jobs. You're not going to, have the kind of resources that you need to do that stuff. And I think that's a real problem. And also these huge deficits from the tax cuts. I just think there's going to be a reckoning someday, and it won't be my generation that's going to be stuck paying for this stuff. And also, when you go into the capital markets and you're going to have to raise so much money in tax revenue to actually pay off these deficits and deal with the debt service, just the interest. By putting so much of the federal government on a credit card, all we're doing is mortgaging the future. And I think that's really unfair to a younger generation of Americans, frankly.
Yeah, it's time for a progressive version of fiscal conservatism, I think.
Well, I just think fiscal sanity, and I don't say the progressives have all the answers. Conservatives used to have some answers. I mean, it used to be Republicans who were really upset about federal deficits when there were Democrats in the White House anyway. They were really just apoplectic about it when Clinton and Obama were there. They don't seem to care as much when their own people are there. But there is a need for the old-fashioned, frankly, sense of Republican fiscal conservatism that, you watched your budgets closely, that you didn't let things get out of hand, and that you set very clear priorities. You had things like capital funds, where you put money into rainy day funds so that you put money aside. So if there was a recession, you had some way to tide it over, just like in your own household. You want a little savings account there in case somebody gets laid off or is sick, or, your car loses a transmission in one of our potholes, your axle. And, you want something to tide you over. But there seems to be now just, okay, we're just going to go out and cut everybody's taxes and, give the economy a sugar rush. And then we'll worry about it later on.
Not a good move.
No way to run a railroad, I don't think. But
no,
what do I know?
Surely not. Publix radio, what's anything that we should look forward to specifically? You just ran that great 1 square mile on Pawtucket. I saw there was an RFP on MacKay today. Maybe they'll put an aquarium there, something crazy. Hopefully not an aquarium, but
yeah, I've looked at the RFP. In fact, I'm in the middle of doing something with it. I've got when I go back to the office this afternoon, hopefully I'm talking to the commerce people about just what they want. It seems to me like it's a little pie in the sky at this point. They're looking for something that'll come in there, preferably a sports team, to take this over. I mean, I think at some point they may be looking at a real tough scenario, which is not how you can repurpose this thing, but can we tear it down and put something else there, like an industrial park? Can we put they say there's a need for a new high school in the city. Is there something else that can go there? Because I just don't, at this point, see how first of all, you're not going to get AAA baseball. The International League won't allow a club that close to Worcester. Secondly, AA baseball, Hartford has that, Portland. I'm not sure that they would even allow that. Then all there's left as far as baseball is, like the Northern
Cape
League.
Cod League.
The Northern League, yes, the very small minors, the things like Burlington, Vermont has with only half the season. And you really don't need, and you can't support the kind of infrastructure that you have, which needs millions of dollars, as we all know, to be put in there. The last time McCoy really had any investment in it was back in the 1990s, and so I think that hopefully they're not just dreaming, that there's some other ideas there, maybe Major League Soccer, but it's hard. It's a hard place to get to.
It is, yeah.
And one of the reasons that they wanted the park downtown was because McCoy is not close to public transportation. As we all know, when you're somebody who first moves to Rhode Island, so go to McCoy Stadium, when you get off the interstate in Pawtucket, you've got to, kind of meander through those streets, and people get lost, and it's not an easy place to find. And it's not on a rail link. It's not really on a big bus link. There is some parking there, but it's not great. There's no garages, and there's nothing else there. There's no shopping. There's no real entertainment. There's that one Irish pub and a couple of restaurants, but it's not a destination kind of place, the kind of things that people are looking for with entertainment now. So I just don't know how realistic repurposing McCoy Stadium as a sports venue is. And I think the state and the city are going to find that out as we go forward. It's too bad. I love baseball. And it's great baseball at a really reasonable price. If you like baseball, AAA, they had, the partnership with the Boston big team has been a great thing for Pawtucket for all these years. But obviously now there's a new chapter. The team's leaving for Worcester, as we all know, so they're going to have to find something else to go there.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see what happens. I can't imagine that you could put a sporting, even if you had a combination of Major League Lacrosse, Major League Soccer, I don't even know what else, maybe drone racing or future sports and e-sport arena.
Demolition Derby.
Yeah, right.
I mean, no, there's only so many, and there's only so many concerts you could run there in the summer. I understand they've had some nice concerts there, but, you've got the Xfinity Center. You're not Fenway Park. People want to go to some of the bigger bands, Gillette. For big venues around here, we've got plenty for these summer concerts, and I just don't know. Arts festivals are fine and all that, but I just look at a place that really was busy, all summer, and I don't know what you can come up with. And to me, it's still kind of looking at it, it's almost like a mystery of what you can come up with that could replicate what the Pawtucket Red Sox have done for this area since the 1970s.
We'll be listening on all around Rhode Island and southeastern Massachusetts, a variety of signals, and you can listen on thepublicsradio.org, right?
Yes, and also our website, thepublicsradio.org, is a great place if you've missed things on the air. The best signal is 89.3 FM, which has been really good, and the beauty of our station is, while a lot of people are cutting back, we're actually growing. We've just hired a new reporter for southeastern Massachusetts. They have other plans in the offing, including starting an investigative unit, doing more arts coverage, which we know this is a big area for arts and music, Rhode Island, southeastern Mass, particularly the Providence area. So we want to do more with the arts and obviously more local reporting, environmental reporting, education, healthcare. And we're trying to really build a strong newsroom in all of those areas. So anybody who can help us out when we go on our pledge drives, I know sometimes you think we're annoying, but it's for a good cause.
Yeah, and I'd say, just adding as well, the UMass Dartmouth radio station was one of the last, particularly when BRU, and it was one of the last pillars of local and independent music that you could broadcast.
It was.
So I personally am looking forward to seeing the Public's radio kind of pay back some of that karma through some more local music and arts coverage, and I can't wait for it. I think I think it'll be worth the wait.
I think we really need that because, like I say, this area, in particular, and it's not everybody points to like the big stuff, Trinity Rep and the GAM and RISD, but it's far more than that, as you know. There's a good music scene here that, since the Journal no longer really covers it, it's very strong. There's a real community around those folks. I mean, just a couple of weeks ago, Mark Cutler, the great Mark Cutler, I call him Rhode Island's Tom Petty, and he was sick, and the community just came together at the Met. There must have been 600-700 people there.
Yeah, and they did 2 nights of that.
They did, and it was just remarkable how many people came together for Mark and all of these bands who did this benefit. And we forget how much really, really good local music we have. And I wish there were more venues. There used to be more. I wish there were fewer casinos doing these kind of washed up national acts.
Exactly.
And there were more folks with these emerging bands coming and playing in, local places.
Yep, including stopping by the podcast and then going up to your studio for a pregame interview before their show at the Columbus or whatever. Let's build the infrastructure.
That would be fine with me.
Thanks for joining in on the Bartholomewtown Podcast. I'll be back on Friday with brand new content, but you may always listen at bartholomewtown.com or wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, I'm Bill Bartholomew. We'll talk soon.